The Weddell Sea does not move the way open ocean does. It shifts in slow, grinding increments. Ice forms in layers across the surface, thickens, compresses, and then locks into place. The water beneath remains black and cold. The air above is still. In this part of Antarctica, the landscape is not dramatic. It is flat, white, silent. The horizon offers no reference point. Sky and ice blend into a single plane of gray and white. There is no shadow, no depth, just distance. In early 1916, 28 men were living on a piece of ice roughly 200 yards across. The ice was not stable. It cracked at irregular intervals. It rose and fell with the swell beneath it. The men had erected tents using salvaged canvas and wood. They had stacked supplies in low piles, covered with more canvas. Smoke rose from a blubber stove. The wind carried it horizontally across the camp before it disappeared. The men moved slowly. Their clothing was stiff with salt and grease. Their faces were darkened by soot and sun. They did not speak often. This was not a base camp. It was not a station. It was a temporary refuge on a piece of floating ice in one of the most remote regions on Earth. The men had no ship, no radio, no certainty of rescue. They were drifting north with the pack ice, at the mercy of currents they could not see or predict. The nearest land was Elephant Island, over 200 miles away. The nearest human settlement was more than 1,000 miles beyond that. The camp was called Patience Camp. The name was not ironic. It was descriptive. The men were the crew of the Endurance, a 3-masted barquentine that had departed from South Georgia Island in December 1914. The ship had been built in Norway, reinforced with extra planking and cross beams to withstand pressure from pack ice. It was commanded by Ernest Shackleton, an Irish-born explorer who had already come within 97 miles of the South Pole on a previous expedition. Shackleton's goal for this journey was to cross the Antarctic continent on foot, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, a distance of roughly 1,800 miles. No one had done it. It would be the last great polar journey. The crew was composed of sailors, scientists, a carpenter, a cook, a photographer, and a surgeon. Many had applied by letter. Some had sailed with Shackleton before. Others were young and eager. A few were experienced polar hands. Most were British, though there were also Australians, New Zealanders, and one American. They had been selected not only for skill, but for temperament. Shackleton believed that personality mattered more than expertise in the kind of isolation they would face. The Endurance entered the Weddell Sea in early January 1915. Within days, the ship encountered heavy pack ice. Progress slowed. Shackleton ordered the crew to navigate through leads, narrow channels of open water between ice floes. The ship pushed forward when it could. When it could not, the crew waited. By mid-January, the Endurance was locked in place. The ice had closed around the hull. The ship could not move. At first, this was not unusual. Polar ships often became trapped temporarily. Shackleton believed the ice would break up in the spring. The crew settled into a routine. They maintained the ship. They exercised the dogs. They played football on the ice. They held concerts in the ship's hold. The photographer, Frank Hurley, took pictures. The scientist, Leonard Hussey, played his banjo. The cook, Charles Green, continued to prepare meals. Morale remained stable. But the ice did not break up. The pressure increased. The Endurance was not sitting on the surface of the ice. It was embedded within it. As the pack shifted, the ice pressed against the hull. Timbers groaned. Beams cracked. Water began to seep into the lower compartments. Shackleton ordered the pumps manned around the clock. The crew worked in shifts, but the water continued to rise. On October 27, 1915, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The crew salvaged what they could: tents, sledges, food, navigational instruments, clothing, and 3 lifeboats. They hauled everything onto the ice and set up a camp within sight of the Endurance. For weeks, they watched the ship struggle. The hull twisted, the masts tilted, the stern lifted out of the ice. On November 21, the Endurance sank. The men stood in silence and watched it go down. They were now stranded on the ice with no means of communication and no expectation of rescue. No one knew where they were. Shackleton made the decision to march west toward Paulet Island, where he believed there was a cache of supplies left by a previous expedition. The distance was over 300 miles. The march began in late October. The men harnessed themselves to sledges and dragged them across the ice. Each sledge weighed hundreds of pounds. The surface was uneven. Ridges of pressure ice, snowdrifts, slush pools, and cracks that opened without warning. The temperature hovered near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The men wore layers of wool and canvas. Their boots were stiff, their hands blistered inside wet gloves. Progress was measured in yards. After a week, they had covered fewer than 10 miles. Shackleton realized the march was unsustainable. The men were exhausted. The dogs were struggling. The ice ahead was impassable. He ordered a halt. They set up a new camp and called it Ocean Camp. It was still within sight of where the Endurance had gone down. For 2 months, the crew remained at Ocean Camp. They salvaged additional supplies from the wreckage of the ship, which had resurfaced briefly before sinking again. They killed seals for meat and blubber. They rationed food carefully. Shackleton maintained strict discipline. Every man had a role. Watches were kept. Meals were regular. The routine provided structure, but the ice was drifting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pack was moving north. Shackleton tracked their position using a sextant and chronometer. The drift was erratic, but the general direction was favorable. They were moving toward open water. If the ice broke up, they could launch the lifeboats. If it did not, they would continue drifting until the ice disintegrated beneath them. In late December, the ice began to break apart. Leads widened. Open water appeared in patches. Shackleton ordered the crew to move camp again. They dragged the boats and supplies across broken ice to a more stable flow. On December 29, they established Patience Camp. The name reflected their situation. There was nothing to do but wait. Life at Patience Camp was governed by routine. The men woke at dawn, though in the Antarctic summer, daylight was nearly constant. They melted ice for drinking water. They cooked seal and penguin meat over blubber stoves. The smell of burning fat was constant. Smoke hung low over the camp. The men ate in shifts, sitting on crates or folded canvas. Meals were quiet. Conversation was minimal. Each man had assigned duties. Some maintained the boats, checking for leaks and repairing seams with salvaged materials. Others hunted seals and penguins, which provided the bulk of their food. The blubber was rendered for fuel. The skins were used for repairs. Nothing was wasted. The cook, Charles Green, prepared meals with precision despite limited ingredients. He rationed sugar, flour, and tea carefully. The men trusted him. Shackleton moved among the crew constantly. He observed their condition, their mood, their health. He spoke to each man individually. He made decisions quietly and conveyed them without drama. He did not raise his voice. He did not display fear. The men responded to this. They followed orders without question. They trusted his judgment. The photographer, Frank Hurley, continued to document the camp. He took pictures of the men, the ice, the seals, the boats. He worked methodically, protecting his glass plates and camera equipment from moisture and cold. His images were composed and clear. They showed men in dirty clothing, sitting on ice, staring at nothing. They showed the vastness of the landscape and the smallness of the camp. They were not dramatic. They were factual. The surgeon, Alexander Macklin, monitored the crew's health. He treated frostbite, infections, and minor injuries. He watched for signs of scurvy and malnutrition. The men were losing weight. Their faces were gaunt. Their gums bled occasionally. But there were no serious illnesses. Macklin attributed this to the seal meat, which provided enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy. He kept notes in a journal. His handwriting was neat. The ice continued to drift. Shackleton took daily sextant readings and plotted their position on a chart. The drift was slow and irregular, but the overall direction remained north. By early March, they had drifted more than 100 miles from where the Endurance had sunk. The ice beneath them was thinning, leads were widening. Open water appeared more frequently. The men began to prepare the boats. Time became difficult to measure. Days blended together. The men marked the passage of time by meals, by watch shifts, by the changing angle of the sun. Weeks passed. The ice cracked and reformed. The camp shifted position slightly. The men adapted. They repaired tents. They patched clothing. They killed seals. They melted ice. They waited. Shackleton did not speak of rescue. He did not speculate. He focused on immediate tasks. He rationed food. He monitored the ice. He kept the men occupied. He understood that idleness was dangerous. The men responded by remaining disciplined. They did not complain. They did not panic. They worked. The cold was constant but manageable. The men had adapted to it. Their bodies had adjusted. Their clothing, though filthy, was layered and effective. Frostbite was rare. Hypothermia was avoided. The greatest danger was not the cold. It was the instability of the ice. Cracks appeared without warning. Floes collided and ground against each other. The noise was deep and resonant, like distant thunder. The men learned to recognize the sounds. They learned when to move and when to stay still. By late March, the ice was breaking up rapidly. Large sections of the floe split apart. Open water surrounded the camp. The men loaded the boats and prepared to launch. On April 9, 1916, after more than 3 months on the ice, Shackleton gave the order to abandon Patience Camp. The men climbed into the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, and pushed off into the freezing water. The boats were overcrowded. Each carried supplies, equipment, and men. The James Caird held 11 men. The Dudley Docker held 9. The Stancomb Wills, the smallest, held 8. The men sat shoulder to shoulder, their legs folded, their hands gripping oars or the gunwales. The water was black and filled with ice. The boats moved slowly, weaving between floes, pushing through slush. The nearest land was Elephant Island, roughly 60 miles to the northwest. Shackleton aimed for it. The men rowed in shifts. The water was rough. Waves broke over the bows. The men bailed constantly. Their clothing was soaked. The temperature was below freezing. Spray froze on their faces and beards. Their hands went numb. They rowed anyway. The journey took 7 days. At night, the boats pulled alongside ice floes, and the men climbed out to rest. They slept on the ice, wrapped in wet sleeping bags. They melted ice for water. They ate cold seal meat. They shivered. In the morning, they climbed back into the boats and rowed again. On April 15, they reached Elephant Island. It was a desolate spit of rock and ice, but it was land. The men stumbled onto the beach and collapsed. Some wept. Others simply lay still. It was the first time they had stood on solid ground in nearly 500 days. But Elephant Island was not a solution. It was uninhabited. No ships passed nearby. No one would find them there. Shackleton knew this. Within days, he announced his plan. He would take a small crew and sail one of the boats, the James Caird, to South Georgia Island, more than 800 miles away across the Southern Ocean. From there, he would arrange a rescue. On April 24, Shackleton and 5 men departed in the James Caird. The remaining 22 men stayed on Elephant Island under the command of Frank Wild. They had enough food for several weeks, but no certainty of rescue. They built a shelter using the 2 remaining boats and salvaged canvas. They called it the Snuggery. Inside, it was dark and cramped and smelled of blubber and sweat. The men lay side by side, waiting. Weeks passed. Food ran low. The men hunted seals and penguins, but the animals were scarce. They rationed carefully. They boiled seaweed. They chewed on seal bones. They weakened. Some developed frostbite. Others showed signs of malnutrition. Morale declined. Wild maintained discipline. He kept the men occupied. He told them Shackleton would return. He said it every day. By late August, 4 months had passed. The men were gaunt. Their clothing was in tatters. Their faces were hollow. They no longer spoke of rescue. They focused only on the next meal, the next day. Time had stopped meaning anything. On August 30, a ship appeared on the horizon. It was a small Chilean steamer called the Yelcho. Shackleton was on board. He had reached South Georgia after a harrowing 16-day voyage. He had crossed the uncharted interior of the island on foot. He had arranged rescue. He had returned. The men on Elephant Island did not cheer. They simply stood and waited. The ship anchored offshore. A boat was lowered. Shackleton came ashore. The men shook his hand. They climbed into the boat. They were taken aboard the Yelcho. All 22 were alive. The Yelcho sailed north to Punta Arenas, Chile. The men were given medical care, food, and clean clothing. They were weak, but stable. No one had died. This was noted by the press, but Shackleton did not celebrate. He thanked the Chilean government. He thanked his crew. He did not give interviews. He arranged for the men to return home. The expedition had failed. The continent had not been crossed. The Endurance had been lost. The scientific work had been abandoned. But the crew had survived. Shackleton considered this the only measure that mattered. The men dispersed. Some returned to England. Others went to Australia or New Zealand. Many enlisted in the military. World War I was still being fought. The polar adventure was quickly overshadowed by the war. The men did not speak of their ordeal often. When they did, they spoke quietly. Frank Hurley's photographs were published. They showed the Endurance locked in ice. They showed the crew on the floe. They showed the boats being dragged across broken ice. The images were stark and clear. They were not sensational. They documented what had happened. Shackleton wrote a book. He called it South. It was a straightforward account of the expedition. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He described what had occurred, day by day. The book was published in 1919. It sold modestly. Shackleton died in 1922 on another Antarctic expedition. He was 47 years old. The survival of Shackleton's crew is studied not because it was dramatic, but because it was methodical. Every decision Shackleton made was designed to preserve life. He did not take unnecessary risks. He did not prioritize glory. He focused on discipline, routine, and morale. He kept the men occupied. He kept them fed. He kept them moving. When movement was impossible, he kept them waiting. The men trusted him because he did not lie. He did not promise rescue. He did not offer false hope. He told them what was possible and what was not. He asked them to endure. They did. The story is not one of heroism in the traditional sense. There were no battles, no dramatic rescues, no miraculous escapes. There was only ice, cold, hunger, and time. The men survived because they maintained structure. They followed orders. They trusted their leader. They did not break. In 1916, while millions were dying in the trenches of Europe, 28 men were drifting on a piece of ice in the Weddell Sea. They were alone. They were forgotten. And they survived. The ice eventually melted. The men went home. The story became history. But the Weddell Sea remains. It still freezes. It still drifts. And it is still silent.